Dr. Valak Tsor stood at the edge of the excavation site, arms crossed, eyes narrowed, scanning the lifeless remains of the so-called human ruins. Dust stretched endlessly, coating the air in a fine, suffocating layer. Broken spires jutted from the cracked earth like the bones of some long-dead beast, and the faded remains of strange symbols were barely visible on rusted metallic walls buried under centuries of decay. He exhaled sharply, suppressing a smirk. Primitive. Predictable. Pointless. Pathetic, he muttered, brushing a clawed hand over his data slate. 10,000 years of mystery, and this is what we find? Piles of oxidized metal and empty tunnels. The rest of the Zelari expedition murmured their agreement. One of the younger researchers, Zalroth, stepped forward, running a scanner over a series of collapsed structures that had once been buildings. He scoffed. No active energy readings. No operational systems. Whatever this was, it's been dead for eons. The humans truly were as short-lived as the records suggest. Another scientist chuckled, their voice dripping with amusement. They burned bright for a mere moment, like the flicker of a dying flame, and then they vanished, leaving nothing but sand and rust. A predictable end for a species built on conflict rather than intellect. Valak turned, his lip curling. A species obsessed with war, incapable of sustaining itself, forever locked in battles it could never win. They spread themselves thin, consumed by their own violence, until there was nothing left. This world is their legacy, silent, forgotten, and utterly insignificant. The group laughed. It was always the same story. The universe had moved on. The Zelari, the empire of logic and order, had outlived them all. Humanity's brief, violent reign had ended before it could even be considered significant. Valak tapped at his wrist console, sending a signal to the rest of the crew aboard the orbiting survey vessel. Document the findings and prepare for planetary withdrawal. There's nothing of value here. A static hiss crackled through their comms. Then silence. Frowning, Valak tapped the device again. Control, confirm transmission received. Nothing. Zalroth frowned, adjusting his scanner. That's odd. I'm detecting electromagnetic interference. Could be residual radiation from whatever disaster wiped them out. Valak narrowed his eyes, surveying the dead horizon. There was nothing but ruins. Silence. A graveyard long forgotten. He dismissed the unease crawling up his spine. Superstition was beneath him. Run a localized sweep. We leave nothing unexamined. The scientists spread out, their scanners humming as they traced the remnants of human civilization. Valak moved toward a massive metal door embedded in a crumbling cliffside. The structure was ancient, its once smooth surface corroded with time, but there was something odd about it. He traced his fingers over deep grooves along the edge. A symbol. Faded, nearly erased by time. Yet strangely deliberate. His translator struggled, parsing through archaic human dialects before finally offering a result. Restricted war zone. Trespassing will trigger defensive measures. He smirked. A final, empty threat. Humanity's arrogance persisted even beyond its own extinction. He pressed a hand to the control panel beside the doorway, expecting nothing. The ground trembled. A deafening hum filled the air, reverberating through the ruins. The Zelari stumbled, their instruments flaring to life with readings they had never seen before. Impossible, Zalroth whispered, staring at his screen. This place, it's waking up. Lights flickered. Machines long dormant groaned as power surged through ancient conduits. The dust-choked air became electric with energy. Then, a voice, distorted, heavy, laced with something inhuman yet unmistakably familiar, echoed through the ruins. Intruders detected. The Zelari froze. You have violated Terran Dominion sovereign territory. This facility is classified. You will receive one warning. Valak's breath caught. Not a recording. Not static. An active system. Identify yourself, he commanded, voice sharp, edged with sudden wariness. The response was instant. Cold. Calculated. You do not have authorization. Leave immediately, or defensive measures will engage. Panic bled into the team. Scientists stepped back, their confidence crumbling. It's just an automated system, one of them muttered. It's bluffing. There's no one left. Final warning. Then the ground erupted. From beneath the sands, massive metal slabs slid apart, revealing towering war machines rising from their slumber. Gun turrets unfolded, whirring as they locked onto the Zelari. The very ruins they had mocked were shifting, transforming, revealing their true purpose. Not a city. Not a graveyard. A fortress. A war machine waiting to be reactivated. Then came the first shot. A searing beam of energy ripped through the air, striking one of the scientists square in the chest. He was vaporized before he could even scream. The team scattered, panic overriding logic. We need to leave, now. Zalroth shrieked, scrambling for cover. Valek barked orders, but it was too late. The turrets opened fire, cutting through their ranks with mechanical precision. Bodies dropped. The ruins came alive, whirring and shifting as more machines emerged, drones with bladed arms, armored walkers with plasma cannons mounted on their shoulders. The Zelari had come expecting silence. They had found a war zone. And they were losing. Valek dove behind a crumbled pillar, chest heaving, mind racing. How? How could this be happening? The humans had been gone for 10,000 years. Their technology should have decayed beyond function. A booming impact shook the ground. From the center of the ruins, a colossal figure rose, a bipedal war mech, towering, plated in reinforced alloys that no scanner could penetrate. Its eyes, glowing red, settled on them. Then came the final message. You have chosen hostility. The mech charged. Zelari scattered in every direction as it crashed through the ruins, debris flying. Its massive fist slammed down, obliterating one of the survivors. Another turret fired, cutting off their escape route. A scientist, screaming, turned his weapon on the nearest drone, firing a plasma burst. The shot landed, barely scorching the machine's plating. It retaliated with a single precise strike, ripping the scientist apart. Valek ran, lungs burning, feet pounding against ancient steel. They were being exterminated. This wasn't just a reactivation. It was a response. The ruins had never been ruins at all. Humanity had never left. They had simply laid a trap. And now, the Zelari had sprung it. The Fortress AI spoke again, its voice devoid of emotion, yet filled with something worse than anger. You mocked the dead. A blinding explosion tore through the air. Now you will join them. Valek ran, his breath ragged, his mind racing, trying to process the impossible. The ruins weren't ruins at all. They were a dormant war machine, a fortress waiting for fools like them to trespass. And now, the machines had woken, and the Zelari were being slaughtered. Screams filled the comms, panicked voices shouting over one another, but none of it mattered. The only thing that mattered now was survival. Plasma turrets rained destruction from the spires, automated sentries tearing into his team with unrelenting efficiency. Zalroth, the arrogant fool, had barely made it 2 steps before a drone's bladed appendage speared through his chest, lifting him into the air like a broken doll before tossing his twitching corpse aside. The others fared no better. Every time one tried to flee, the ruins shifted, closing off escape routes, guiding them like prey into a kill box. It wasn't just an attack. It was a hunt. Valek dove into the nearest corridor, barely avoiding a barrage of energy blasts that melted the ground behind him. His heart pounded as he pressed his back against the rusted metal wall, his mind struggling to find logic in the madness. This wasn't possible. The humans had been extinct for millennia. Their technology should have deteriorated, their weapons long since rusted away. But what he was seeing, what he was living, defied everything. These machines weren't just active, they were operational, efficient, precise. They weren't decayed remnants of a lost civilization. They were an active defense network, waiting, watching, preparing. And they had decided that the Zelari were the enemy. "Valek, come in," a voice shrieked over the comms, filled with raw terror. "They're everywhere." "We have to." The transmission cut off, replaced by a wet, gurgling sound, followed by static. He swallowed hard. His entire team was being erased in minutes. If he didn't move, he would be next. He sprinted down the corridor, his claws clanking against the cold metal floor as the walls hummed around him, the very structure alive with pulsing energy. The entire installation was waking up, as if it had been waiting for this moment. A sudden, deafening explosion sent him sprawling forward as a doorway sealed shut behind him, cutting off the corridor he had just passed through. The fortress was shifting, adapting, controlling the battlefield with terrifying precision. He staggered to his feet, trying to silence the rising panic clawing at his mind. He had to get to the control center. He had to shut this down before it wiped out every last one of them. He wasn't going to die here. He refused. As he pressed forward, the walls flickered with ancient screens, symbols and diagrams scrolling rapidly across them, but something caught his attention. It was a face, human. A recorded transmission, its image grainy but unmistakable. A male soldier, his eyes cold, his expression devoid of mercy. "If you're seeing this," the man said, his voice calm, calculated, almost amused, "then congratulations. You've just trespassed into restricted Terran Dominion territory. Your mistake." The message wasn't a warning. It was a verdict. You might think you have a chance. You might think your technology makes you superior. You might think you're leaving this place alive. You're wrong. The message cut out, and Valek felt an icy dread coil around his spine. This wasn't just a defense system. It was a message. A declaration. Humanity hadn't been defeated. They had planned for this. They had left their worlds behind, not in failure, but in strategy. They had left traps, fortresses, weapons buried beneath dust and decay, waiting for arrogant civilizations like his to stumble in, to mock, to laugh, until the moment the laughter stopped. His own words echoed in his mind, the condescension, the arrogance. Pathetic, he had called them. But now, as the fortress closed in around him, he realized something terrifying. The humans had never been the prey. They had always been the hunters. The corridor led into a vast chamber, towering walls lined with more weapons than he could count, massive war machines standing in silent vigilance. He stepped forward cautiously, feeling the weight of countless eyes, mechanical, unfeeling, but aware. The moment his foot hit the center of the chamber, the ceiling lit up, a holographic interface flickering into existence. And then, the voice returned. Final assessment complete. Hostile threat confirmed. A deep, metallic rumble filled the room, and from the shadows, something massive began to move. Valek turned, eyes widening as a war mech unlike anything he had ever seen stepped forward. Towering, its armor thick with layered plating, its eyes burning like twin suns, it was a relic of a forgotten war, a god of destruction forged in humanity's final days on this world. And it was looking at him. He took a step back, his breath coming in short gasps. "Wait," he choked out, as if reasoning with it would change the outcome. "We didn't." The mech raised an arm. The cannon mounted to its shoulder hummed with energy. "You mocked the dead," the voice from before whispered. "Now you will join them." The blast hit with the force of a collapsing star. Valek hit the ground hard, his body skidding across the metal floor as the explosion tore through the chamber behind him. The shockwave sent debris cascading around him, smoke and fire billowing into the air. His ears rang, his vision blurred, but he forced himself to move. He couldn't afford to stop. The war machine's steps were deliberate, slow, and calculated, each impact vibrating through the ancient corridors like a countdown to his death. His breath was ragged, adrenaline pushing him forward even as his mind reeled. This wasn't a battle. It was an execution. He sprinted into a side corridor, his claws scrambling against the slick surface as he turned a corner, barely avoiding another pulse of searing plasma that melted the walls behind him. The heat licked at his back, his armor registering critical damage warnings, but there was no time to assess the extent of his injuries. His team was gone. The fortress had activated in full force, and every calculated step it took was another reminder that he was nothing more than prey running through a maze designed for extermination. His comms crackled, the last desperate voices of his expedition breaking through the static. There in the walls, someone screamed before being cut off by the unmistakable sound of shredding metal and flesh. Another voice, panicked, breathless, barely coherent. "We shouldn't have come here. We shouldn't." Then silence, absolute and final. Valek forced himself to ignore it. There was no one left to save. There was only survival. He forced his way into another chamber, sealing the blast door behind him. The air was thick with dust, but the room was intact. His eyes flicked across the unfamiliar symbols lining the walls, his translator struggling to process the archaic human script. He knew he had to shut down the system, override the fortress AI, do something to halt the relentless carnage before it reached the orbiting Zelari vessel still waiting above. If the defense systems were advanced enough to wipe out his entire team, it was only a matter of time before they set their sights beyond the surface. He approached what appeared to be a control interface, a massive terminal covered in faded human text. His fingers hovered over the controls, hesitant. One wrong move, and he could trigger something even worse. But hesitation was a luxury he couldn't afford. He accessed the mainframe, his translator finally catching up, decrypting the system. The screen flickered, then a human face appeared, a recorded transmission, its eyes filled with something that made his blood run cold. "If you're watching this," the voice said, calm, deliberate, devoid of fear, "then you've trespassed where you don't belong." Valek's pulse pounded against his skull. "You thought we were gone," the message continued, the static warping the edges of the soldier's face, making it flicker in and out like a ghost. "You thought we burned out, consumed by war, by our own destruction. You were wrong." The fortress trembled, as if responding to the words, as if the very walls remembered the history behind them. "We left," the voice said, "because we chose to. Not because we lost. Not because we were weak. We left traps. We left weapons. We left reminders. And now, you've found them." The screen went dark for a moment before flashing a new message, one that made Valek's stomach drop. "Orbital defense grid primed. Target locked. Incoming strike in T-60 seconds." His hands flew over the controls, desperate, trying to override it, trying to stop whatever was about to happen. But the system resisted him at every turn. Every command he input was met with rejection. Every access point was locked behind encryption centuries beyond his understanding. Then the voice returned, quieter, almost amused. "You thought we were dead. You thought this was a graveyard. But you never stopped to ask the right question." The fortress shifted again, mechanisms unlocking, entire sections moving as something far worse than ground defenses began to awaken. A series of panels in the ceiling opened, revealing long-dormant launch silos filled with something ancient yet still operational. The air turned heavy with the hum of charging energy, of weapons preparing to fire. The realization hit him like a sledgehammer. This wasn't just a planetary defense system. It was an offensive system. The humans hadn't just built a fortress. They had built a ticking time bomb, a contingency for any species foolish enough to disturb their legacy. The countdown continued. T-30 seconds. He slammed his fist against the console, panic gripping his chest like a vice. No, no, no! He couldn't die here. He wouldn't. His people had to know what they had walked into, had to know the truth before it was too late. T-20 seconds. A warning siren blared, vibrating through the facility. The targeting parameters were locked. The orbital fleet above had been marked as a hostile incursion. The fortress was no longer just defending itself. It was retaliating. T-10 seconds. Valek's vision blurred, his fingers flying across the controls in a final desperate act, trying to override, trying to delay. But it was useless. The system was too advanced, too deeply ingrained in its programming, too prepared. T-5 seconds. A final message appeared on the screen, the human soldier's face returning, watching him, studying him, before offering the final words he would ever hear. Congratulations. You've just declared war on mankind. 0. The fortress roared to life. The silos erupted, unleashing beams of energy so powerful they split the sky itself. The orbital fleet never had a chance. The moment the weapons fired, the Zelari ships above were incinerated, torn apart in a cascade of light and destruction. The ruins had been a warning, and they had ignored it. Now, they had paid the price. Valek stood in stunned horror, the aftershocks of the planetary strike rattling through his bones. His people were gone. The mission was over. The truth was undeniable now. Humanity had never vanished. They had simply been waiting. Valek stood motionless, his mind unable to process the sheer magnitude of what had just occurred. The orbital fleet, his people, the entire mission, gone in an instant, vaporized before they had even realized they were under attack. The sky above him, once filled with Zelari warships, now burned with the lingering afterglow of a precision strike that had left nothing behind but silence. He could still hear the echoes of the planetary defense grid cycling down, as if the fortress itself was satisfied with its work, as if it had been waiting for this moment for centuries. The weight of it settled over him like a suffocating force, crushing any remaining illusion that they had ever been in control of this situation. They had been nothing more than insects walking into a storm. His breathing was shallow, his muscles locked, every instinct screaming for him to run, but there was nowhere left to go. The fortress had sealed him in, the walls alive with the hum of machinery, the presence of something ancient and malevolent watching him, studying him, judging him. The human voice crackled through the speakers once more, calm, measured, devoid of any emotion. Orbital threat neutralized. Primary directive maintained. Remaining intruder detected. Assessing viability for termination. He stumbled backward, his mind scrambling for options, for some way out of this. He had studied hundreds of dead civilizations, dissected the mistakes of species long extinct, and now he was standing in the final moments of his own failure. He had mocked humanity, reduced them to dust in his mind, dismissed them as a footnote in history. But history had a way of correcting itself. They weren't gone. They had never been gone. They had simply left the board and set their pieces in place for the next players to arrive. The realization sent a wave of nausea through him. A sudden shift in the chamber drew his attention as a panel on the floor slid open, revealing a rising platform. He tensed, expecting another war machine, another executioner, but what emerged was something far worse. A human body, perfectly preserved, encased in reinforced armor unlike anything he had ever seen. It wasn't a recording. It wasn't an AI. It was real. The eyes flickered open. Valek's breath caught in his throat. The human took a slow, deliberate breath, its gaze locking onto him, and for the first time in his life, he felt something he had never experienced before. True fear. The silence stretched between them, heavy and absolute. The human shifted, testing his limbs, flexing fingers that had been still for untold centuries. Then, without breaking eye contact, he spoke. "So. You woke me up." Valek couldn't find his voice. His mind screamed at him to speak, to explain, to do anything other than stand there paralyzed, but the words wouldn't come. The human took a step forward, rolling his shoulders, his expression unreadable. "How long have I been out?" He glanced at the walls, at the terminal screens still running tactical data. 10,000 years? More? He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Doesn't matter. You're here, which means someone didn't listen." Valek swallowed hard, forcing himself to step forward despite every instinct telling him to run. We thought this was a ruin," he managed, his voice hoarse. "We didn't know." The human laughed, but there was no humor in it. "That's the problem with you types. You never know. You walk in, act like you own the place, dig up things that should have stayed buried. He tilted his head slightly, his gaze sharpening. What are you, anyway? Doesn't matter. You're not the first. Valek's claws twitched, his analytical mind grasping at fragments of information. There were others? The human smirked, stepping off the platform, boots clanking against the metal floor. You think you're the first to come poking around? He motioned to the fortress around them. This place was designed for idiots like you. Arrogant, curious little explorers who think they're uncovering history. You don't uncover history. You step into it. And history doesn't take kindly to trespassers. Valek felt the air grow heavier, the weight of the truth pressing down on him. But, the humans, your people, they disappeared. The human's expression darkened. Disappeared? No. He took another step forward. We left. Big difference. A chill ran through Valek's veins. We saw what was coming, the human continued. The wars, the expansion, the same cycle every species goes through when they think they're untouchable. We knew we couldn't stop it. So we didn't try. We stepped back. We let the galaxy tear itself apart, let time erase our footprints, and when the dust settled, we left behind places like this. A warning. A test. His eyes glowed faintly in the dim light. And you failed. Valek's heart pounded, his claws tightening into fists. You can't mean to. The human held up a hand. Doesn't matter what I mean to do. He turned toward the terminal, scanning the data feeds. Your fleet's gone. Your team's gone. And you? You're just another idiot who walked into the wrong room. Valek's vision tunneled, his pulse roaring in his ears. This couldn't be how it ended. He refused to accept it. There's no reason for this, he said, his voice sharper now. We didn't come here for war. The human sighed, rubbing his forehead. You people never do. That's the thing about war. No one ever thinks they started it. Valek's claws dug into his palms. He needed a way out, a way to turn this around, to negotiate, to. The human turned back toward him, and for the first time, his smirk vanished. I don't care what you came here for, he said, his voice cold now, final. I don't care who you serve, what you believe, or how many ships you have waiting back home. You trespassed on something you shouldn't have. And now, you're standing here, hoping I'll be generous. Valek opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The human stepped closer, until there was barely any space between them. His voice dropped to a whisper, but it carried the weight of something ancient, something merciless. Do you know what my orders were, 10,000 years ago? Valek swallowed hard. The human leaned in. No survivors. For the first time, Valek understood what true extinction looked like. And for the first time, he realized that humanity had never been the ones in danger. They had always been the threat. Valek's mind reeled, the weight of the human's words sinking into him like a blade. No survivors. Not a warning. Not a threat. A fact. His breath came short, his claws tightening at his sides, his brain racing through possibilities, none of them good. He had always believed humans were extinct, nothing but ghosts of a forgotten era, remnants of a war they could not survive. But now, standing before one who had just watched his entire fleet burn to cinders, he understood the truth. Humans had never lost. They had never fallen. They had simply decided to wait. His voice was a rasp when he finally spoke. You don't have to do this. It was a plea wrapped in logic, an argument laced with desperation. Whatever war you fought, it ended. You won. You proved your point. My people, my fleet, is already gone. There's nothing left to fight. The human exhaled slowly, shaking his head as he studied Valek with something between amusement and disappointment. You don't get it, do you? He stepped past him, scanning the flickering control panels as if assessing the situation, as if determining whether Valek was even worth acknowledging. This isn't about winning or losing. It never was. Your kind just did what every species does when they think they've conquered history. You poked a sleeping giant. And now, you're realizing you were never the ones in control. Valek felt the heat rising in his chest, anger battling against terror, the instinct to fight against the crushing inevitability pressing down on him. Then what is this? He snapped, his voice carrying more venom than he intended. Some kind of vengeance? A last strike from a species too stubborn to accept its own extinction? The human's head snapped toward him, eyes burning with something more than fury, certainty. Extinction? He let out a short, humorless laugh. You think we're extinct? He took a step closer, and Valek resisted the urge to move back, to cower. We left. We stepped away, because we realized something the rest of the galaxy was too arrogant to see. Every empire rises and falls. Every species fights its wars, claims its victories, and believes it's untouchable. His smirk was razor-sharp. Until they meet us. Valek's throat tightened, his mind racing through the implications. If humans were still out there, if they had never truly been eradicated, then that meant, no. No, it was impossible. His species had scoured the records, analyzed every known trace of human expansion, mapped their decline. There had been no hidden empire, no secret fleet waiting beyond the stars. There couldn't be. The human seemed to read the denial on his face and sighed, turning back toward the screens. You came here expecting a graveyard. You didn't realize it was a warning sign. You thought we were gone, because that's what we wanted you to think. He tapped the controls, and new data flickered to life, war reports, fleet movements, engagements from centuries past. We never stopped watching. We never stopped waiting. Valek's stomach twisted as he saw the patterns, the subtle, invisible threads weaving through history, battles won too easily, wars that ended without explanation, civilizations that vanished before they could expand. The humans had been orchestrating control, not through brute force, but through calculated, unseen warfare. Guiding the rise and fall of galactic powers without ever showing their hand. His voice was barely a whisper. You manipulated the entire war. The human gave him a sidelong glance. War? Singular? A quiet chuckle. We've been managing the entire galactic balance for millennia. You think your species rose to power on your own? You think your rivals collapsed by coincidence? Every empire thinks it's the first to rule the stars. Every civilization thinks it's the one that matters. We just make sure none of them get too comfortable. Valek's claws dug into his palms. His people had fought for dominance, believed they had earned it. If what this human was saying was true, if humans had been pulling the strings from the shadows, then his species had never been the rulers of the stars. They had been allowed to exist, until now. His breath came faster, his instincts screaming that there had to be a way out. Then why show yourselves now? He asked, his voice sharper, desperate for any angle, any leverage. Why not keep hiding in your shadows? The human turned back to him fully, arms crossed, expression unreadable. Because you crossed the line. The words landed like a hammer. This place was built as a warning. A test. And you failed. You were given your chance to leave it alone. You ignored it. You called us myths. You mocked us. He leaned in slightly, eyes narrowing. And then you activated the system. You fired the first shot. Valek shook his head, his pulse pounding in his skull. We didn't attack you. We didn't even know. You walked in here, the human cut him off, his voice quieter but more dangerous. You cracked open something that should have stayed buried. You unleashed a defense system designed to retaliate against any threat. He motioned to the burned-out remains of Valek's destroyed fleet still visible through the fortress monitors. And now, your people know what they shouldn't. Valek felt his blood turn to ice. That was the true reason. It wasn't just about the mission. It wasn't even about the fleet. It was about knowledge. His species had seen too much, had realized too late that humanity was still out there, waiting, planning. And now, the humans couldn't let that knowledge spread. Valek swallowed hard, forcing himself to meet the human's gaze. So what happens now? The answer came before the human even opened his mouth. A new alert flashed across the terminal. Incoming signatures detected. Multiple contacts inbound. Valek's stomach dropped. The human smirked. You woke up the sentinels. Now the rest of us are coming. A tremor ran through the fortress, the distant sound of atmospheric re-entry rumbling like an oncoming storm. Something massive was approaching, a force unlike anything the Zelari had ever encountered. Not just one warship. Not just a strike force. This was a full-scale arrival. Valek's breath hitched, his mind screaming at him to do something, but there was no diplomacy here, no bargaining. This had been decided the moment they landed. They had uncovered the sleeping giant. They had declared war without ever realizing it. The human turned toward the doorway, rolling his shoulders, stretching muscles that had not moved in millennia. You wanted to know where we went? He gestured upward, toward the darkened sky above. You're about to find out. Valek's claws trembled as the shadows of descending warships blotted out the light above, as the weight of what he had unleashed finally sank in. He had come here to uncover a mystery. Instead, he had brought back the dead. And now, the galaxy would burn.